a reminder, what we are doing is we have now these people who are coming to photocopy their BTech projects. Each one of them will take a certain amount of time to complete, and each of these things request has a delay, not a delay, deadline. And we are trying to finish the jobs in such a way that nobody is delayed too much. Right? So supposing we have two jobs, one will get done in 1 unit of time, other one gets 10 units of time, but the deadline for the second one is 10. Right? So I claim that you could have two possible, obviously there are only two jobs, you could either do it T1 followed by T2, followed by T2. What do you do? T followed by 1. These are the only two orders in which you could do this. So here what happens is that overall because it is 10 plus 1, we end up spending 11 units of time doing this. So what is the penalty for the first one? Right? Because T1 can afford to finish after 100 units of time. We have finished well before that, so there is no penalty. But what about the second guy? So it should have finished at 10, now it's finished at 11. So here here now so therefore the second schedule achieves something where nobody is delayed. First one delays the second job by 1 unit of time. We want to minimize the delays, the maximum delays. Maximum delay is 1 or 0. Obviously 0 is better. So we'll choose. So what does this show? Shows that it's not best to choose the shortest things first. So the other thing that you could argue is that, okay, the reason I want to postpone one is because it's got a lot of time. It needs only 1 unit of time, but it can happen up to the 100th time thing. So maybe the fact that it has got a cushion of 99 units of time is good for it, whereas this guy has got a tight thing, right? He has to finish by time in 10 and it has to take 10 times. So therefore, it has no cushion at all. Right? So we might argue that that is the reason why we picked 2 ahead of 1. So understand, the second request has got 0 kind of, there is no flexibility at all. First one has got a lot of flexibility. So maybe flexibility is the answer, not shortness of the time. So now supposing we do now which is more flexible? This is the first one. The second one has got 0 flexibility. If you don't schedule it immediately, the second one is going to experience a delay. Because it's still the same. It takes. So the second request is the same. If it doesn't get done immediately, it's going to experience a delay. The first one can happen, but it can't happen too late. That's the point. So now if we do the same thing again, we have the same. what we get here is the first request goes first, it finishes at time 1, it is allowed to finish up to time 2, so there is no penalty. Second one, it should have finished at 10, it goes to 11, it has delay 1. If I do it the other way around, this has 0 delay, but this now has overshot from 2 to 11, so this is delay 9. So in this situation, I claim this is actually better, okay? Because that maximum delay that anybody experiences is only one time, whereas here the maximum delay that the shorter job experiences is 9 times. Okay? So this means that by slack time I mean how much difference is there, how far away is the deadline compared to the length of the, that is, how much flexibility do I have in moving it up and down from the starting time unit without crossing the, okay, so that thing which has time 10 and delay and deadline 10 has no flexibility, because if I move it even by 1, I get a delay. This one unit job in the first case could move 100 units, but now I can move 2, but still it has more flexibility than a 0 phase. It could move to the first unit or the second unit. Unfortunately, the other guy is 10 units long, so it doesn't have a choice of going to the second unit. If it's not in the first unit, it goes 11. And the 11th thing gets left. Right? So these are things which don't work. Okay? So again, the question is, what is a natural greedy strategy? Because presumably there is a greedy strategy, otherwise this would not be discussed. Right? So the greedy strategy, which seems to look at the criteria like we saw in the last example with the auditorium, it looks like what you want to optimize on is, you know, how much time you keep the auditorium free by taking the shortest job, by taking the one which rules out the minimum number of requests, but those things don't work. Right? So similarly here, the one which seems to, like the shortest job first seems to be good, because it says that other things will be delayed less, because they get postponed less, but that doesn't seem to work. Nor does it seem to say that you keep the guys who are flexible pending, so that also seems to not work. Okay? So something similar to the earlier thing will work. The thing is you have to prove why. The earliest deadline first actually works. So in the first case we had, go back, delay is the amount by which you have overshot the deadline. So in the first case, for example, if you finish at 11 when your deadline is 10, then the delay is 1. So how much, so that deadline is an absolute time. It is on at time equal to 10, I must finish. And if you actually finish at time equal to 11, then your delay is 1. So it's the actual finishing time minus when the latest you are allowed to finish. That is the deadline. So now in this earlier thing, the first example, the deadlines are 10 and 100. And if our strategy is to pick the earliest deadline first, then we would naturally pick 2 before 1. Because 10 is smaller than 100. And it works. Second one, the deadlines are 2 and 10. So since 2 is smaller than 10, we pick 2 first. Okay? And again, here we cannot avoid it. There we actually avoided a delay by picking 10 before 100. We get a 0 delay situation. Here we don't get a 0 delay situation. We have to choose between a delay of 1 and a delay of 9. Okay? But the one where I pick 2 before 10 gives me the smaller delay. Okay? Smaller maximum delay. Remember, we're only talking about the maximum. As I said, a lot of people could be accumulating a delay of small amount, and the total delay that they accumulate may be a lot. Yeah, or we could have only one person who's delayed by a lot. So we could have one request which is delayed by 10. We could have 100 requests which are delayed by 1. And we would say that the one request delayed by 10 is bad compared to 100 requests delayed by 1. So we are not adding up the delays. We are saying maximum delay. The worst delay that any one request suffers should be minimized. Okay? So therefore, this seems to be a strategy, works on these two examples. So why does it work in general? Okay? So the algorithm is very simple. It's even simpler than the previous thing because there's nothing to be eliminated. It's just saying everything has to be scheduled. The earlier thing, there were some requests which are not compatible with each other, so if you pick one, then you have to rule out some and so on. Here is nothing like that. Everything has to happen. The question is you have to decide what order it has to happen. So you just arbitrarily decide that you will order them by the deadline and then do it in that order. So once you have sorted it, you just walk through that list and put it one after the other. The first thing which should be obvious is that so remember, the situation is not that these requests are coming to you as you are doing it. They've all come. So you have taken all the things are sitting on your counter, you're going to do them one after the other. Everything is already given to you. So you gain nothing by taking a lunch break. You should just do them all. Because if you take a break and postpone it, then if you shifted it left, the delay will only improve. Right? So what does our algorithm say? You just do it one after the other in the order of delay, of deadline. But you don't wait and say, okay, no, that thing can actually wait until 100, so let me start it after 70. You don't do that. You just do it one after the other. And the claim is that any optimum solution which minimizes the delay should not have gaps. Because if you had gaps, you could get a better solution. May not be better, but you can't get a worse solution by reducing. You can assume there are no gaps. Right? So as usual, what we have to do is claim that our algorithm produces a solution which is at least as good as any solution anybody else can do by brute force or dynamic programming or whatever they do. They cannot produce something which has better delay than ours. So what did we do in the earlier case? In the earlier case, we compared our solution to the other solution and said step by step our solution is always better. Here we are going to do something different. We are going to say that you give me any solution which you claim is optimum. I will step by step change it so that your solution is same as my solution. Now notice here that there I had to pick subset. Right? I had to pick some k request for the auditorium. You pick a different k. So there may not be an easy way to say I substitute your 7th request by my first request and so on and convert them to the same solution. Whereas here I have to pick all n jobs, you have to pick all n jobs. The only thing is the order in which we do that. So maybe I can take your sequence and move things around so that your sequence becomes my sequence without changing the delay. In that case, since your thing was optimum and you changed it from your sequence to my sequence without changing the delay, mine is also optimum. Okay, that's what we're going to do. Right? So we're going to show that the optimum solution can be transformed into the solution that our algorithm is. And in the process of transformation, we do not increase the delay. So therefore, if the optimum guy had the best delay, and the transformation did not increase the delay, then my algorithm also has the best. Strategy is going to be And of course, when I transform, I mean transform without changing V. Otherwise, so what is the feature of our, our algorithm produces a solution in some sequence S1 to Sn. Right? What is our algorithm guarantee? It guarantees that the deadline of the first job that we pick is less than or equal to the deadline of the second job that we pick, and so on. Okay? This is the algorithm. Right? We sort it by deadline, and then which is executed in that order. Now, it could be equal. I'm not claiming that all the deadlines are different, but you will never pick an earlier deadline after a later deadline. But we cannot promise this of the optimum solution. The optimum solution somebody else produces need not have this property. If it does have this property, then I have to first argue that it is the same. But if it doesn't have this property, I have to transform. So now one solution, one situation we have to, so say the so it will also have a sequence of n things, but this O1 to On may not be S1 to Sn. Now this may have what is called an so what is an inversion? Something which violates that, right? So I have some my sequence, I have a job which is scheduled for, say, OI, and later on I have a job J which is scheduled, so somewhere in that sequence, but it does not satisfy that deadline property. So we have deadline of I is strictly more than the deadline of J. This is the situation which says that certainly the solution produced, claimed optimum solution, is not compatible with my solution because my solution will never produce something. So the optimum solution may have inversion, may have more than one. Know that how many inversions does this have? A is our algorithm. It doesn't have. By assumption, it doesn't have any. So then the question is, suppose there are other solutions which we have. Supposing the optimum solution which is given to me also has zero inversion, and does it mean that they're the same? a kind of trick question. So of course, if all the deadlines were different, then there is only one sorted order. If the deadlines are all separate, if I give you an array with distinct elements, there's only one way of sorting it. If I give an array with duplicate elements, then the duplicate elements could be in any order amongst them. So that doesn't count as an inversion. Remember that an inversion is only when I have a violation of the deadline in a strict sense. But I could have a block of requests which are scheduled by me in one order, by you in another order, but they all have the same deadline. So that is one case that we have to consider. So if I have no inversions, then they may not be equal, but does it matter? I could have a situation where I have so they all have the same deadline. Now the optimum solution might have done it in a different order. So it might have done this does 8, maybe it does 7. Right? There is no inversion. So I'm claiming this is the only situation that can happen. If I have different deadlines, then we must agree because there are no inversions. I'm saying if the optimum thing has no inversions and I have no inversions, then the difference can only be in these blocks of requests which have the same deadline, where I do them in one sequence, you do them in another sequence. So now the question is, does it matter? Now remember, we are minimizing the maximum deadline. So among these, all have the same deadline. Right? So in the first one, which is the job which has going to experience the maximum delay? So supposing there are only 3 jobs with this particular deadline. So supposing there is a delay, if there is no delay, both of them are 0. So they both start at the same point and they end at the same point. It's only that within them are permission. Supposing there is a delay, so supposing this is my deadline. So my deadline happens somewhere before these 3 jobs end. Then I claim that for both cases, match delay is the same. So only who is getting maximum delayed? I mean, in one case, S8 is the one that is suffering the penalty. In the other case, it is S6 which is suffering the penalty. But the last job in each block ends at the same time. And their delay is with respect to the same deadline because they all have the same deadline. So therefore, together these 3 jobs, the maximum delay is the same in whichever order I do. So if I achieve a situation in which I have 0 inversions between the optimum solution and my solution, then I can do what I wanted. What is my final goal? My final goal is to make the O solution look like the A solution. Okay? So I can take these black guys and reorder them as 6, 7, 8 and I will get no change. Right? So my job is to reduce the optimum solution to one which has no inversion. If I have no inversions, I reach this. So therefore, so therefore, eliminate all inversions in the O solution, we are done. Right? So suppose we take the supposing the O solution has at least one inverse. So what does it mean? It means that there is some earlier request whose deadline is strictly later than some later request. So if I look at the deadlines, what I expect in my solutions, the deadlines are always increasing. Right? I am sorting them in order of deadline. So the earliest deadline, then the next one. So the optimal deadline looks like this. Not optimal. I algorithm. Look like this. If I go from left to right, the deadline of each request that I look at is either bigger than or equal to the left one on its left. But in my O solution, I have some deadline here and some later deadline. There is an I which is at a higher deadline. But now I claim that if I am going from left to right and if I drop, there must be some place where I am dropping for the first time. So I claim that this must be going from here. It goes up more, then it comes down, and then it comes down, and it comes down again. It should be something like this. Okay? But the fact that from here to here I go down means there must be a place where from one job to the next job I must go down. I can't overall go down without taking the first step. Right? So somewhere along the way, namely here for instance, is the first place it does go down. So there must be must have, I claim, some OJ plus 1 such that DJ is greater than. There must be some place where this job has a deadline which is strictly more than the next job, because otherwise I can't go from a higher deadline to a lower deadline. If it is only going up all the time, it will keep going up, but I must come down. So somewhere I have to cross. Right? So there must be two consecutive things. Is that clear? So if I have at least one deadline, then I can find at least one place where the deadline discrepancy, this inversion happens one after the other. So take the leftmost cell. Now I have this. OJ and OJ plus 1. And the deadlines are reversed. Okay? So I have something like, let us assume without loss of generality that everything will get delayed, whatever I do. So maybe I have DJ happens there, but DJ is bigger than DJ plus 1. So therefore, somewhere further left, even to the left of this, so let me put it here for now. Okay. So I picked OJ before OJ plus 1, but I shouldn't have, because dj happened later than dj plus 1. My real algorithm would have not done it in this order. But somehow the optimal algorithm is presented to me has this. Okay? So now my question is, what happens if I undo this? Delays are the same, so I'm just keeping the same notation so that we don't. Okay. So OJ plus 1 comes first, OJ comes second, but the delays are at the same place. So this is the delay for this guy, this is the delay for this guy. This is the delay for this guy, I mean deadline for this guy. Okay. So what is the maximum delay there? So maximum delay is from the earlier deadline to the later finishing time. So you can pictorially see that this is messed up. Right? So here what is the delay here? So first of all, it is the maximum of these two things. But I claim that the delay of OJ plus 1, because it has moved left, has only reduced. So if the delay, the maximum delay is coming because of OJ plus 1, it has got a smaller delay than it. But the delay of OJ has increased. Okay. So if it is this one, claim that because dj is to the right of dj plus 1 and the finishing time is the same. So the time from that deadline can only be less than it was before. So if the delay, the new maximum is because of OJ, then the delay that OJ is experiencing cannot be any more than the delay that OJ plus 1 was already experiencing. And if because of OJ plus 1, it has to be strictly less because it has moved to the left. Right? So I'm claiming that the result of inverting these two things to the order which I would like to see cannot increase the delay. That's all I have to prove. Okay, I don't have to even prove that it's better. I just have to prove it's no worse. So swapping that we have. We have removed one inversion. Right? So we said that O had some inversions. Of those inversions, we said there must be some which are adjacent. Right? So if we take the total number of inversions in O, it is reduced by at least one. Okay, I claim that we can keep doing this. So we can systematically eliminate every inversion in O by exchanging the two adjacent things that are contributing to the inversion. Even though the actual inversion may be far away, it must be made up of these smaller inversions. So every such swap reduces the number of inversions in O. And every such swap does not increase the delay. So this is what I meant by saying that we transform the O solution to our A solution. So we take whatever is given to us and we identify what is wrong with it from our perspective. What is wrong with it is that some things are given the wrong way in terms of their deadlines. So we systematically, it's like taking some piece of thread which has been knotted up and we are unknotting it. So everywhere where it is twisted in the way we don't want, we are twisting it back. So we keep untwisting until we eliminate all inversions. We have eliminated all inversions. As I said, we have still not necessarily got what we wanted, because we had that previous situation where we could have a block with the same delay, same deadline. But that doesn't matter, then we know how to do it. So once we get to zero inversions, we have already said it doesn't matter. Because in zero inversions, the only thing that can happen is that equal deadline blocks could be in some random order, but all orders are the same. So this is it. So this is what is traditionally called systematically transform an arbitrary optimal solution to match right? So in the first problem, we could not do this, as I said, because the two solutions look very different. So to transform it would mean to take out one request from that guy's list and put one request from greedy list and so on, which is not very easy to do. So there we just inductively showed that the two solutions, step by step, kind of the greedy thing is at least as good as the other. Whereas here we actually take the optimal solution and transform it, permute, exchange these things step by step to get this. So these are basically the two broad normal strategies for greedy algorithms, but I will give you some more examples in a second. So here once again, just to finish off the thing, like before, the penalty is value. See, once we have sorted it by deadline, then we just read it off in that order. So that just takes the order n. We have to list it out. So the work is in the sorting, so it's an n log n. So the thing you must remember is that n log n is actually, you should think of n log n as n. It is not, log n is very small. If you are doing like, if there are 1 million requests, then even if you take log to the base 2, log to the base 2 of 1000 is 10. So log of million is 20. So it is like 20 times. If it is 1 billion, it is 30 times. So it is, whereas if it is 1 million square, then it becomes 10 to the power 12. 10 to the power 12 will take you like 1000 days or something. So this is what you have to worry about. So n square is, though theoretically n square is good, n square is practically significantly worse than n log n. If you can get anything down to n log n, you are in good shape. So there is a merit to doing greedy simply because the saving is huge in terms of the complexity of it. It looks like, you know, n and something, but that something is log n versus another n. Okay, so it's kind of hard to so we look at that earlier problem, the auditorium problem. We want to analyze the number of requests, and this we saw was we could do this order of deadline, order of finishing time. So what if we do instead? Right? So supposing, so our thing was, as I said, uh, if we had, for example, one request which will take the entire month, okay, and we have 5 requests which will take 1 day each, then we would prefer the 5 requests to take 1 day each. But if you are actually charging rent for the auditorium, then the 5 requests which use the auditorium for 1 day each will give me 5 days rent, or the other will give me 29 days rent. Right? So therefore, this solution changes. More generally, I could even charge different rent depending on who's using it. Right? So I might give it at a low rate for some non-profit organization or some private, somebody wants to hold a wedding in the auditorium, I might charge a lot more and so on. So therefore, each request could come with some associated revenue. So it takes so many days and they're willing to pay you so much. Okay? So now if you pick the one who pays you, then obviously it may not be the same as the maximizing number. As I said, in this 1 day at a time, even if I have a uniform rate, maximizing the number of short requests may not give me as much revenue as one long request. So then it's not clear that greedy works anymore. It looks very similar, but it's not clear that greedy works anymore. It's not to say that greedy does not work, but the earlier greedy strategies, all of them fail. And if all of them fail, then this, so for instance, the first 3 strategies fail if you just count that the revenue, no matter whether it's 1 day or 29 days, they pay you 1 rupee. So supposing the rent of the auditorium is the same regardless of how many days they want to use, then maximizing the rent is the same as maximizing the number of requests. So those first 3 strategies fail for that case. And the last strategy will fail in a situation where you have, for example, 2 things which give you low revenue overlapping with 1 thing which gives you high revenue. So the one thing with high revenue would not be picked because you would try to pick 2 things. But the one thing with, supposing there's one day event which will give you a crore of rupees and the others are all paying hundreds of rupees, then you would obviously pick that one day event and cancel everything. So all those 4 strategies don't work. Is there a 5th strategy works? I don't know. But then once you run out of obvious strategies, then you start looking at dynamic programming. So you say, okay, if I choose this request, then I get so much rent. If I don't choose this request, I get so much rent. If I choose this request, I reduce the number of jobs by so much. If I don't choose this request, all the remaining jobs are still available, and so on. And then you, but it's not easy to look at a problem and decide whether or not this is going to work. So coming up with a greedy strategy and proving it correct, unfortunately, requires a fair amount of insight. Now, most of the times, you can be sure that greedy will not work. But if it does work, it can be a huge failure. So therefore, there is some incentive to try and do it because nlogn is better than SQL. So you cannot do dynamic programming any of these better than SQL. Sometimes you can include them. But just to remind you, I think it's not part of this series. There is this, so there is thing, sorry. Spend a little bit of time on. So there is a thing called Huffman coding. So the idea of coding is that you need to send a message for which you need to represent symbols using a limited alphabet. So for our purposes, we can assume that we are sending everything in binary. So now how do you write letters, say A to Z, using binary symbols? Now there are 26 letters from A to Z. So you want to represent this. Let's say we just want to send capital letters. Can only transmit or store or whatever. Now the importance of this is, as we all know, when you download something or something, a compressed thing will be faster and it will take less resources. Right? So these are typically the reasons why you want to code things in an efficient way. So we said that this has got 26 letters. So 26 more than 16 and less than 32. So if I use only 4 symbols, 0, 1 symbols, I can only have 16 different combinations. So if I have a block of 4 bits to represent a letter, I can only represent 16 different letters, but I have 26. So I have to go to 5. So if I use 5 letters, of course there are some symbols some combinations which are unused, but I can't do anything in between. I cannot use 4.5. Because I can only send a 0 or a 1. I can't send half a 0 or half. So therefore in this particular thing, if I therefore send, I am forced to per symbol, per letter that I transmit, I send 5 bits to encode that thing. Therefore, my overall length is, if I have an n symbol message, so this is the straightforward thing. So now the question is, can we do better? So the strategy is that you might want to represent letters by varying lengths. So some letters you use 5, but we know that we use all 5. Then there are 6 wasted slots because there are 6 sequences which out of 32 which are unused. So maybe we can use a combination of 4 and 5, make some 4, some 5. But maybe it might even be better to make some 2 and some 7. So 5 guarantees that everything is represented, but it could be good to have smaller things for letters which happen more frequently, because finally we are counting the number of bits that we send for a message. So it stands to reason from what we know that not all letters, like some letters like Q and X and Z and all that are rare. If you play Scrabble, you get a lot of points for using these letters. Whereas letters like E and A and all are common. So it makes sense that there are more E's and A's than there are X's and Z's in a typical message. So it's okay to spend a lot of bits for sending one X occasionally and save a lot by sending small messages for A's and B's. So frequent letters get then there's a problem of decoding. So supposing I say that I will represent A by a small sequence 0, 1, and I will represent E by a sequence 1, 0, and I will represent X by one long sequence. Now if I get this sequence at the other end, I must be able to read it. But I can't tell without doing some other linguistic analysis of what is being sent, whether I should read this 6 letters as a unit and think it's an X, or whether I should break it up into these smaller units and think it is 3 letters. So there is some ambiguity. So you don't want this ambiguity. So normally a code problem in our earlier case is that 0, 1 is a prefix of 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1. So this was our, so when we are reading this from left to right, at this point we don't know whether we should stop here and call it anyway, or continue and go further. This is the problem. So while we are trying to read a word, we should not find another word. So if we avoid that, then we are fine. So if the variable length right? So if you have thought about landline numbers, not mobile numbers, landline numbers, different cities have different codes. So for example, 044 is Chennai. So if I start dialing, if I start dialing my phone, 044, then it knows it's Chennai. Then it must treat the remaining part of it as the local number. Let's say I'm dialing it. Now, if you come from other places, for instance, what is this? What is this? So now notice that if I dial 042, then it knows that it must read one more number. It does not end there. The next number is not part of the local number. The STD code is not finished. Okay, so STD codes, phone numbers have this property. If I give you a phone number that starts with a 0, you can uniquely decode it if you know the STD codes. No two STD codes are a prefix. So then you start off by saying, so the earlier decision was that you take all the big cities and give them. You gave them 011, 022, 033, 044, right? So this was when it started. That was Delhi, 22 is Bombay, 33 is Calcutta, 44 is Chennai. But unfortunately, there are more big cities which have become big after that. Okay? So it took a long time before 040 became Hyderabad and 080 became Bangalore, 020 became Pune. Initially, these were not there. So over a period of time, they decided to go back, and I think having a 0 in the STD code was not part of the original plan. There will be a starting 0 and then there will be a number of non-zero digits before you hit the end of the code. But it's no surprise, therefore, that if you go to interior places, you will find STD codes which are 4 digits long and the phone number locally may be 5 digits long. So there are not that many phones locally. So it kind of adds up in a way, because the more obscure a place is in terms of number of people, the more remote it is. Okay, the total number of digits does not change. If you want to memorize your number, you still have to memorize about 10 digits. It's only what is the breakup. Half of it is the STD code and the other half is your local phone number, or the first 2 digits are the STD code and the remaining 8 digits are the phone number. It more or less adds up, but it's not uniform. Okay, it's not always, does not have to be the same number. It's just that this is a trade-off which happens. Okay, so the same trade-off is what we're trying to do for messages. We're trying to say send small things for frequent letters. So people call these big cities a lot, so use small digits. And then they will also have longer numbers locally because they have a lot of phones. So therefore, that trade-off will take. Okay, so these are codes. That's why it's not. I mean, it is not an accident. It's called an STD code. It could be called STD anything, right? So STD identifier. It's not. It's STD code because it's a code. The same way that it's a code. So anyway, so now, what do we want to do? We want to achieve this for our messages, and that requires us to know something. Because unless we know some information about what letters are frequent and what letters are not, okay, it doesn't help us. So we can take a lot of text. So this is literally what people do. I mean, you can take, novels and dictionaries and whatever, legal documents, and just count how many A's are there, how many E's are there, how many C's are there. So you have a total number of letters, you know what fraction of them are A's, what fraction of them are C's. So you can treat these as approximately their relative frequency. Of course, it's not, there might be certain documents where because of the nature of the words used, the actual frequency of a given letter is more or less than what you think it is, but it's going to be roughly the same. So, supposing you have this example. Supposing we just have 5 letters. And after doing this, frequencies means it will be like a ratio, right? Some 1042 A's out of 1 million. So it will be some number like that. So we can count frequencies in that kind of way. So finally, we can have something like, so maybe I'm only sending messages these two things, and here are some numbers. They're not supposed to mean anything, but just some random. What this kind of is supposed to tell us is that roughly speaking, A's and B's are more frequent, then C's, then D's, and then B's. So this is just in order. So 0.3, that is 32% of all the symbols in my text are typically A. 5% are B. Only 5% are B. So what should I do? Ideally, I should allocate sort of sequences to these such that the ones which are less frequent get longer sequences. Now the question is how to do it. How do we allocate? So So now this is the, so here now we have, remember our standard strategy will be, so we have 5 letters. This is more than 2 squared, less than 50. So we have 3 bits. So this is our naive strategy. We just use 3 bits. So we can represent up to 8 symbols with 3 bits. So we only have 5, so 3 are being wasted. So we will end up doing 3n bits for n symbols. You want to know what this is. So now if we take so here is a particular code that I could see. Supposing I see so my encoding is A is 1 1 and so on. So you have to verify this is a code. So one way to verify this is a code is just to represent these things as a binary tree. So you can say that I can start with this point. So 0. So this is my coding, if you think of it as a tree. If I do 1 followed by 1, then I've got an A. If I do 1 followed by 0, then I've got a B. If I do 0 followed by 1, I've got a B. If I do 0 0 1, I've got a C. And if I do 0 0 0, I've got an A. The fact that it's a code basically says that while I'm walking down this tree, I never cross one letter before I hit another letter. So at every point, after I've seen a certain number of zeros and ones, I can unambiguously tell you which letter I've seen. But if it is not a prefix code, then along the path, say 0 1 would be followed by another 0 1 and gives me a different letter. I don't know whether to stop at 0 1 and say it's a B or go continue. Okay? So now what happens if I do this? Okay, now supposing I have now n letters. So on an average, I know that 32% of those letters are A's. Okay? And for A's, I'm going to be using 2 bits, not 3 as I would do in this. Okay? So I will have 0.32 times n times 2 for A. Similarly, I have 0.25 times n times 2 for B. For E, for instance, I'll have 0.05 times n times 3, which will be E. Right? So I can add it up in this way. Right? So I'll end up, I claim, getting, if I add this up, if I do this, I say 0.32 times 2, 0.25 times 3. The ones that were 3 were C and E, right? So 0.2 times E. Many bits I mean. 32% of n bits are so 32% of the n bits require n symbols require 2 bits, 25% requires 2, 20% requires 3, and so on. If I add this all up, I claim to do the arithmetic. End up with so if I uniformly use 3 bits for everything, then I would always use 3n bits. If I do not uniformly use 3 bits but use this kind of clever encoding, then I can actually reduce the, so this is not guaranteed. So somebody could actually produce a message which consists only of E's. If they produce a message consists only of E's, then I will end up using 3 bits for every E. But this is, in a probabilistic sense, I will normally get a saving of 25%. So if your messages are truly representative of this statistical thing that you have collected, if you have read enough messages and if you are actually transmitting messages which look the same, then you would expect to save. This is what you are trying to do. So this is the purpose of coding. Okay, so the question is, how do you come up with, so actually this is not the best you can do, you can actually improve it, okay, to 2.23. So now the question is how. What is the general strategy? So the general strategy is the thing which Huffman came up with. So what he said was that you want to assign the longest code to the least frequent letter. So if I remember, if you imagine that tree which I drew, then the 2 least frequent letters should appear. The longer you go down the tree, the longer the code is. The 2 least frequent letters should come at the bottom. So he said you build up the tree in that way. So you first, so supposing you start with this frequency. So we start off by putting D and E at the bottom because they are. Now for the rest of the whole thing, you think of this as now a single letter, that between D's and E's together they occupy 23% of it. Okay? So you merge them to one. Block. So now I have taken care of D's and E's. So now I think of them together as a single letter. So whatever code I use for them is going to occur 23% of the time. Now I again take the smallest 2. So now the smallest 2 are the DE block and the C block. Right? So now I do this and I combine it this way. Now what I end up with is CDE block which has 0.45. So now among what remains, I take the smallest 2. So the smallest 2 are A and B. Right? So I create a separate A and B block. Now I only have 2 letters. I have this AB block and I have this CDE block. Then I combine it. Then I just write this. So this gives me a code now which assigns, earlier I had assigned 3 bits for C and E. And now I get a code which assigns 3 bits for D and E. The claim is that this, if you do that same calculation and I exchange the 3 bits between the C and the D, it will go from 2.25 to 2.2. So this is Huffman's algorithm. So what Huffman's algorithm is doing is it is kind of greedily assigning longer things to less frequent letters. Okay? So I don't want to spend time now proving it correct because I want to say something else after this. Okay? But essentially what you have to argue is that this process will indeed produce the smallest possible thing. That exchanging things among these will not help in reducing the problem. So this is again an example where a greedy strategy produces something which is immensely useful for practical purposes. So you can take any alphabet provided you have this frequency table given to you. Somebody has done some statistical analysis of a lot of text, and you can then find an optimum way of transforming it. So this is something which I believe is not been done so far, and it's not going to be done in this particular FTP. So I'm not going to give you the full algorithm. But if you remember Dijkstra's algorithm, the idea of Dijkstra's algorithm is that you are given some graph with distances. You have a graph with distances. Given some starting vertex where you start from, and you are given some distances. So each of these edges has got some number. Like what you want to do is find the shortest distance to every vertex from the starting. So sometimes the shortest distance is not the shortest path in terms of edges. Like here, if I take this direct edge from here to here, okay, the cost is 50. Whereas if I go around this long cycle, I go 15 plus 12, 27. Okay. So this is what Dijkstra's algorithm tries to do. So Dijkstra's algorithm achieves its objective by checking a set of vertices to which it has found the shortest path, and then adding one vertex. And that adding is a greedy step. That's the point. Okay. So what it will do is that, okay, I know that the shortest distance from S to S is 0. Okay. Now from the distances that I know, namely S, what is the shortest distance that I can conclude to any other vertex? Then you say, okay, it will say, okay, from S to 1 I can get in 5 steps. So therefore I will claim that there is no shorter path to 1. Now I know shortest paths to S and 1. Now I claim that from 1 to 3 I can get in 5 plus 10, 15 steps. Okay, and there is no other shortest path. And then I will get from 3 to 2 I can get in 27 steps. Therefore there is no other shortest path, and so on. So this process of taking the next thing to be the shortest distance from those which I already know is basically a greedy step. And it's justified by the fact that any other path can only be longer, and therefore implicitly it assumes that all these numbers are not negative. Because there could be a way of saving time by going some other way. Then if you like, you get it, this is toll, and on some roads if you get a discount for traveling on the road, somebody pays you back money, then it's unlikely, but it could happen. So this doesn't work. Okay, so the choice of if you look at that way in which Dijkstra's algorithm makes the choice about which vertex to freeze next as having calculated the shortest distance is actually a greedy. And a very closely related algorithm, so the problem is different, is want to find a tree in this which has minimum cost, then what you would do is you would, depending on what algorithm you are following, but if you are following something like Dijkstra's algorithm, what you will do is you will start from the starting vertex and say, okay, tell me the smallest vertex which I can attach to this to keep it a tree. Then it will say, what is the next smallest vertex I can attach to keep it a tree? That will be this one. Now I have this much, and what is the next smallest vertex I can attach to keep it a tree? I got that one. Now what is the next smallest vertex to attach to keep it a tree? I got this one. Now I can extend this tree by either this 12 edge or that 12 edge. I mean, if I ignore the direction. So I'm ignoring the direction. So say I take this 12 edge. I get this 7 edge. And now, if I choose the 12 edge, I will get a cycle. I will choose the 42 edge. So this is what is called what it does is it starts from a starting vertex and it grows a tree in a greedy fashion. It keeps adding an edge of the smallest size to the existing tree such that the tree remains a tree. There is another algorithm to do the same thing. What this does is it says overall let's take the smallest vertex. So we start with then let's take the next smallest vertex. It doesn't have to be connected to it, unlike in principle. Then let's take the next smallest vertex. Then let's take the next smallest vertex. Then take the next smallest vertex. Then we'll pick one of these 12, but if I pick this 12, and then I'll pick. Right? So what Kruska's algorithm does is it produces these clusters of small edges, and then it groups them together so that it never varies. But both Prim's algorithm and Kruska's algorithm are basically taking the smallest something next. So this is a greedy search. So these are again examples of things which you have to then prove. Why is it true? So in Dijkstra's thing, you have to prove that somehow any other path would be longer. Here you have to show that in any spanning tree that you construct, okay, these smallest edges must be there. Right? So it needs a proof. So the last thing I want to mention today is that, so from a traditional algorithmic perspective, you look at the kind of problems that are addressed in course that is taught or any book that, we always have a kind of small universe of possibilities, and usually greedy doesn't work, and then you can do something like dynamic programming. What do you need to do for dynamic programming? You typically need to set up one large table. Do some ijth entry in the table and do something. So now what if you can't do that? So very often the problem is that in order to do something like dynamic programming, you need to be able to represent this entire problem in a way that you can manipulate an array or something. And often this is not. So if you have large data, makes sort of So it makes a large, so what dynamic programming is doing, as I argued, is that it is essentially doing a clever optimal exploration of all points. If I do this, what happens? If I don't do this, what happens? You just make sure you never do the same thing twice. You never recompute a quantity you've already computed before. But modulo that, you are checking every possible option. Sometimes at every possible option is just too much. So if you're doing some really large scale data which appears in things like machine learning and stuff like that, you have no choice but to be greedy. Because you cannot possibly digest that entire data and do everything. So ultimately what are we trying to do? I claim that what we are trying to do is we are trying to so all these problems you can think of in some way as computing some globally optimum value. Huffman code is trying to produce a translation from alphabet to 0, 1, which minimizes your expected number of bits you will translate. Minimum cost spanning tree is trying to select a subset of edges whose cost is minimum, which form this. Your scheduling problem is trying to either maximize your availability to customers, or it's trying to minimize the maximum delay. So all of these things are optimizing something. You're minimizing something, you're maximizing something, and you want to do it such that it is globally the optimum. Right? It's the best possible solution among all the solutions that are possible. And sometimes a greedy solution achieves that. But as we have seen, it is very sensitive to the problem. If you change that auditorium problem to maximizing revenue, it's not clear that greedy works. So in these kind of situations where you can actually digest the whole problem and process it, dynamic programming is your best bet. You can't think of greedy after thinking about it for half an hour, you just do dynamic programming and go ahead. Later on, maybe some bright idea will strike you and you will get it done. But if you want to solve the problem at hand, just use dynamic programming and proceed. Don't waste your time trying to prove that greedy works. But if you are in the real world, this option is not available. You cannot take all the, for example, telephone records of Airtel and do n-squared on it. As it is, it's growing also at a speed. So in many of these things, you have to do greedy. Except that you don't call it greedy. You call it gradient descent. Okay, so what you are doing is there is a landscape of possibilities. Okay, so you should imagine some kind of a lunar landscape of Android. So there are some valleys and there are peaks and all that. So depending on whether you are going, so you are walking. Supposing you are here and you want to find a minimum value, then you look around you in all possible directions and you take the biggest step that you can take. Conversely, you are trying to find the highest point, you take the biggest step up. You can call it hill climbing if you want. And what will happen is that, supposing you are here, you might find something here, but it's very possible that somewhere far away, where you cannot reach to your approach, there is something still lower. Okay, so you might end up coming here. And then finding that everything around you looks worse than what you have, so you just stop it. So now you find not a global optimum, but a local optimum. But unfortunately, this is the best you can do. So, in practice, therefore, greedy is actually the only workable strategy. And then you have to justify how far or how near you are from this global optimum. But there is no sort of straightforward way, like dynamic programming or something, which will come to your rescue and find that global optimum anyway. There may be special situations where it works, but in most situations it will not work. So greedy is really ingrained very deeply into practical way, practical algorithms are going in terms of processing large data and these kind of things. But in our setting where we are looking at things which fit in memory, so to speak, okay, then greedy is very often a minority case. It works on very specialized cases where it works, and there are, as you can see, something like 6 textbook examples which are there in all textbooks. Therefore, there is no 7. Okay, it's very clear. So there are not that many good examples to motivate, and that's because very often it doesn't work. It's too naive. It just cannot. This local optimum just cannot be the global optimum. And that's the problem. If you can get around this and find the global optimum by another technique, well and good, like dynamic programming. If you cannot, then you must be aware that greedy is the only thing that works. So gradient descent or hill climbing or whatever is the backbone of in some sense, all large-scale algorithms. So it's not something to be dismissed as kind of weak strategy or a strategy for the weak-minded, okay, which is what typically an algorithm textbook will try to tell you. It try to convince you that only naive people who don't know any better will ever try to look for greedy. It is true. You should not expect greedy to work. And if you manage to prove that greedy works, it requires effort and time. But it doesn't mean that greedy is a strategy to be dismissed as useless. It is not at all useless. It is very useful. So with that, I think I'll stop. Any questions, I'll be happy to answer. Yeah, so basically it's what we said, right? What does greedy do? There is a measure, right? So you take a step in the direction which is best with respect to the measure. That's exactly what you're doing in greedy also, right? You're taking the shortest thing next, smallest edge next. Okay, you're picking the 2 letters with the lowest frequency next. That's exactly what happens here. You have some step. If you take that step, then you increase your yield or decrease your yield by the maximum possible. So it's all question of how that cost is stated, and only based on that cost function you make these choices. You cannot. But I'm saying that if you only go by cost functions and what happens when you change some of the parameters, you cannot do any better than that. What you can do, for example, is to start from different random initial fields. So you can do this gradient descent starting at many different places. And if there are different local optima, different places which are not reachable from each other, right? So you should really imagine yourself as somebody walking in some, some unknown landscape. Right? So you just keep going down as far as you can see in the stop. Now you can't see what's over the next mountain. But somebody else who started, somebody else would have dropped into the next time. Now hopefully among all of these you'll find a good answer. So that is one strategy to get on this, to change where you start from. But otherwise the algorithm will typically take you in one direction to a local optimum. And very often the local optimum is not all bad. I mean, it may not be the best possible, but you can live with it. It may be like 5% worse than the global optimum. But for practical purposes, it may not be. For greedy. Yeah, so I think there is no magic thing. So I think if you think about the transformation approach, that is basically an inductive proof. Somehow by induction, either I prove that I have some structure to the solution where inductively I can prove that my structure is as good as the optimum structure, or I have some inductive solution by which I can transform that to this. That is this exchange algorithm. But if you look at, for instance, the way that say Dijkstra's algorithm or the spanning tree algorithm are proved, it is not proved like that. That's a graph theoretic property. It will say that these small edges must be there in every spanning tree. Now that is not an inductive argument. It's just a kind of a structural property of a graph, that if this is the smallest edge in the graph must be there in every spanning tree. That you prove by a separate graph theory. So there is no magic formula, but this inductive thing is one strategy which works. But it is hard work. I mean, coming up with proofs is always hard work. Better to start looking for counterexamples.
Thanks to Professor Madhav for the Yes, I couldn't have asked for a better lecture giving such a panoramic view all the way to some algorithms and machine learning. Thank you very much.
So I try to send these.
By these lectures in MEC, which is part of that Microsoft's massively empowered classrooms. If you go to www.mec.org, there are so many different examples which he has covered there, like knapsack and other scheduling jobs. mec.org.